The first thing I remember is the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses against your ears like a warning, like the world itself has stopped breathing and is waiting for something terrible to happen. I had been on patrol for nearly 6 hours when the storm rolled in, the temperature dropping faster than I had seen all season, the snow coming sideways, sharp as glass against every inch of exposed skin. I had worked these mountains for 11 years, and I had learned to respect that kind of cold, not fear it, but respect it, the way you respect something that has killed before and will kill again without hesitation. My truck crawled along the forest road, its headlights carving 2 pale tunnels through the wall of white, and I was not looking for anything in particular. That is the strange truth about the mornings that change you. You are never looking, and you never expect to find what ultimately finds you. It was the color that made me stop, a small patch of gray against the unblemished white, just off the shoulder of the road, half buried beneath a fallen pine branch. I stopped the truck without thinking, my hand already on the door before the engine was fully off, and the cold hit me like a wall the moment I stepped outside. I pushed through the snow toward that gray shape, telling myself with every step that it was probably nothing, a piece of bark, a clump of dead leaves caught in the wind, but my chest already knew what it was before my eyes confirmed it. He was no bigger than my 2 fists pressed together, a wolf pup, newborn, maybe a few days old at most, lying on his side in the snow with his tiny chest moving in shallow, desperate stutters. His fur was matted and damp, plastered against ribs I could count without touching him, and his eyes were barely open. 2 thin crescents of clouded amber that seemed to be looking at something very far away. I knelt beside him, and I do not think I breathed for a full 10 seconds. The wind howling over the treetops above us, while down at ground level, everything was almost still. Just the 2 of us, and the sound of his breathing, the most fragile sound I had ever heard in my life. I looked around for signs of a pack, for tracks in the snow, for any indication that his mother had been there recently, and found nothing. The storm had erased everything that came before it, and whatever story had brought this pup to this frozen place alone, I would never know the full truth of it. What I knew was only what I could see, a life balanced on the thinnest possible edge, and the cold advancing from every direction. I took off my outer jacket and wrapped him in it as gently as I could, the way you hold something you are terrified of breaking. And he did not struggle, did not make a sound. He simply lay in my hands and breathed those shallow, labored breaths. I carried him back to the truck and turned the heat all the way up, telling myself I was thinking about protocol, about what the ranger station would say, about the proper procedures for wildlife intervention. But the truth is, I was not thinking about any of that. I was just watching him breathe, counting the seconds between each rise and fall of that tiny chest, praying without words to nothing in particular that he would still be there when I looked away. I had no way of knowing then what was coming. I had no way of knowing that this pup's story was not going to end in my truck, or in any place that made logical sense, that it was going to unfold out in those same frozen woods, in the presence of a creature that should have been his natural enemy, and that what happened next would make me question everything I thought I understood about the wild. I released him 3 days later, not because he was fully recovered, but because he was strong enough to stand, and because I had seen something in his eyes that told me keeping him any longer would be taking something from him that I had no right to take. I drove back to the same stretch of forest where I had found him, parked the truck at the tree line, and set him down in the snow at the edge of the woods where the storm had finally broken, and the light was coming through the pines in long, pale columns. He stood there for a moment, his small legs trembling beneath him, his nose working the cold air in quick, urgent pulses. Then he took a few unsteady steps forward and disappeared into the shadow of the trees, and I stayed there watching the place where he had been, feeling something I could not name, not quite loss, not quite relief, but something heavy and quiet that sat between the 2. I came back the next morning, and the morning after that. I told myself it was professional diligence, that I was documenting the reintegration of a wolf pup into its natural environment, that my notebooks and my camera were tools of science and nothing more. But the truth was simpler and less dignified than that. I needed to know he was still alive. On the 4th morning, I found his tracks in a fresh layer of snow, small and erratic, wandering in wide circles through the undergrowth as though he were searching for something he could not identify. They led me deeper into the forest than I usually ventured on foot, past the frozen creek bed and up the long slope toward the granite ridge where the old-growth trees grew so close together that the canopy nearly blocked the sky. That is where I saw her. A grizzly, large, dark-coated, her breath rising in steady clouds in the frigid air, moving through the trees about 40 meters ahead of me with 2 cubs tumbling at her heels. I stopped instantly, every muscle in my body locking into stillness, my hand already reaching for the bear spray at my belt without conscious thought. She had not seen me. Her attention was fixed on something lower to the ground, something small and gray that was standing directly in her path with its legs splayed wide and its head raised, too young and too bewildered to understand that it should have been running. My chest seized. The pup had walked directly into the path of a grizzly mother with cubs. There is almost nothing more dangerous in these mountains, and every instinct in that bear's body should have answered with fury. She lowered her enormous head until her nose was almost level with the snow, and she breathed him in, long, slow, deliberate, while her cubs crowded behind her legs and peered around at the strange small creature their mother was examining. I did not move, I did not breathe. I watched through my binoculars with my heart hammering so loudly I was certain she could hear it. The pup did not run. He stood his ground in that trembling, exhausted way of his and looked up at her with those amber eyes. And what passed between them in that moment I cannot explain with any language that would satisfy a scientist. I only know what I saw. That she did not strike, did not roar, did not drive him away. She made a low sound deep in her chest, something between a rumble and a sigh, and she stepped around him almost carefully. Then she stopped again. She turned her head back toward him, and she waited. The pup took one uncertain step toward her, then another, and something in the forest shifted. Some invisible line was crossed that neither of them could have named, and that I was only barely qualified to witness. I lowered my binoculars and stood in the cold with tears on my face that I did not bother to wipe away. I came back every day after that. I told no one at the station what I had witnessed, not because I was ashamed, but because I was afraid that saying it out loud would somehow break it. The way you are afraid to describe a dream too precisely in case the details dissolve as you speak them. I kept my distance, always upwind, always still, crouching behind the same cluster of snow-heavy spruce trees with my camera pressed to my face and my notebook open on my knee. What I documented over the following weeks defied every framework I had been trained to apply. The pup, I had started calling him Gray in my notes, though I knew better than to name wild animals, had not merely been tolerated by the bear family. He had been absorbed into it, the way a river absorbs a tributary, quietly and completely, as though the arrangement had always been inevitable. He slept pressed against the mother's flank at night, tucked between her massive foreleg and the warm curve of her belly, his gray muzzle resting on her dark fur with a trust so absolute it made my throat tighten every time I saw it. The 2 cubs had accepted him with the straightforward indifference of the very young, wrestling with him in the snow the same way they wrestled with each other, tumbling over him and being tumbled in return. Their small bodies a tangle of brown and gray that was almost impossible to separate from a distance. The mother was the one I watched most closely. She moved through the forest with Gray always within a certain radius, never more than a few body lengths away, and when he strayed too far, drawn by a scent or a sound that his wolf instincts could not ignore, she would make that low rumbling sound I had first heard at their meeting, and he would circle back to her like a compass needle returning to north. She was not simply enduring his presence. She was keeping him. There were moments that I recorded in my notebook with shaking handwriting because I did not trust my own perception. Once when Gray stumbled on a steep section of ice and let out a sharp, startled yelp, she was at his side before he had finished falling. Not running exactly, but moving with a sudden focused purpose that left no doubt about her intent. She nosed him from head to tail the way she nosed her own cubs after a tumble, methodical and unhurried, satisfying herself that he was unharmed before she stepped back and resumed her path as though nothing had interrupted it. I had spent years in these mountains cataloging behavior, writing field reports that reduced the complexity of wild lives to bullet points and Latin terminology. I had always believed that kept me honest, that the clinical distance was a form of respect, a refusal to project human meaning onto animal action. But watching this bear with this wolf, I found the clinical distance closing day by day, until it was gone entirely. What she was doing had a name in the scientific literature: interspecies adoption, documented in captivity, theorized in controlled conditions. But seeing it here, in the uncontrolled wilderness, in the deep cold, without any human hand guiding it, was something else altogether. It was not a curiosity. It was not an anomaly. It felt, in those quiet mornings among the spruce trees, like something that had been true for a very long time, and that I was simply late in arriving to witness. Gray was becoming something the forest had no category for. Not quite wolf, not quite bear, but entirely himself, learning the world through two sets of instincts that should have been irreconcilable, held together by the warmth of a body that had chosen, for reasons I would spend years trying to understand, to make room for him. Spring came slowly that year, the way it always does at altitude, not as an arrival, but as a gradual loosening. The snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, the creek beds waking up beneath their ice with a low, persistent murmur that you could hear if you stood still long enough and pressed the cold out of your mind. I had been documenting Gray and the bear family for nearly 3 months by then, and I had filled 2 full notebooks and an external hard drive with footage that I still did not know how to explain to anyone. It was in the second week of April that I noticed the change in him. He was larger now, not bear large, but no longer the trembling scrap of fur I had carried in my jacket on that first frozen morning, and something in the way he moved through the forest had begun to shift, a new restlessness entering his step, his nose lifting more frequently into the wind, as though it were carrying messages meant specifically for him. He still slept beside the mother at night. He still wrestled with the cubs in the muddy patches where the snow had receded. But there was something in his amber eyes that had not been there before, a reaching, a listening, directed toward something beyond the tree line. I knew what it was. I had known it was coming since the beginning, and I had not allowed myself to think about it directly. The way you avoid looking at the sun, he was hearing something in the distance that the bear family could not hear, a frequency that belonged to his first nature, the one that had been waiting underneath everything else all along. The wild does not forget what it made you, no matter how warm the body is that holds you through the winter. The morning it happened, I was at my usual post before dawn, the air sharp and clean in a way that felt like a beginning. The bear family emerged from the tree line at their customary hour, the mother leading, the 2 cubs jostling behind her, and Gray moving at her left flank as he always did. They crossed the open meadow toward the creek, and then Gray stopped. He stood completely still in the wet grass, with his head raised and every muscle in his body oriented toward the ridge to the north, toward a sound I could not hear but that I knew was there. The mother stopped too. She turned and looked at him, not the quick checking glance she gave her cubs, but a long, full look, the kind that takes something in completely and holds it. Gray turned his head toward her, and for a moment they simply regarded each other across the small distance between them, while the cubs tumbled forward toward the creek, oblivious. Something passed between them in that stillness. Something I have tried to write down many times and have never managed to render accurately, because it was not a thing that happened in any language I know how to use. Then he turned back toward the ridge. He took 3 steps, stopped, looked back at her once more, and she had not moved, was still watching him with that steady, unreadable gaze, and then he kept walking. He did not run. He walked with a calm and quiet purpose through the long spring grass until the tree line swallowed him and he was gone. I stayed in that meadow for a long time after the bear and her cubs disappeared downstream. I looked at the place where Gray had last been visible, and I thought about instinct, about how we define it as a constraint, as the bars of a cage that biology builds around every living thing, and I wondered if we have it wrong. Because what I had witnessed over those 3 months was not 2 sets of instincts in conflict. It was something more generous than that, a mother who had made room inside her own nature for something her nature had no name for, and a young wolf who had carried that gift with him into the rest of his life. The snow had taught me that the wildest thing of all is not the storm and not the cold. It is the inexplicable warmth that persists inside them.